This is a multi-part project. There is several different components to the project. The property is owned by a nonprofit called the Sanctuary Forest Incorporated. We have a commercial harvest component that we just finished up, and the wood went to Forever Redwood. They were a specialized buyer for us, and we worked out a special deal, and that was really cool. Also happening, we have a fire hazard reduction component that we did with prisoners with a conservation camp crew. We also have a bunch of road work to reduce sedimentation into the Metz River, which is right there. We also have an in-stream log and boulder component for adding habitat complexity that the Sanctuary Forest and the Metz Salmon Group are working on. And that's what these logs are for. We did the commercial harvest, and they've come back in and they're removing a few more specific trees. They're being barked like this so that they last longer in the river. The bark reduces the potential for insect damage because you're removing the cambium, and so the trees will actually last longer in the river when you're spending good public money on doing complexity and habitat type placement. We're just trying to look at past harvesting regimes in the stand, as well as the kind of restoration forestry that we're practicing and why we might be doing it one way or another. So if you take a good look around at the spacing and size of the stumps from the original harvest, Whitethorn Valley had several sawmills in it and has a long history of doing timber management. And this particular stand has not been harvested for more than 40 years, probably closer to 50 or 60. But as you can see here, there's some really high stumps where they were getting up above the swell of the old growth and cutting off the trees. But if you look at the size and the spacing of the stumps, it gives a good indication of the kind of carrying capacity of the site. And so what we did in here is just on the other side of that stump, there was a tree that had a really wide crown, but it wasn't a good growing tree. And we removed that tree in favor of the nice younger regeneration of redwood in the back there. We left a nice spacing that is similar to the kind of spacing we saw in the old growth stand. We are constantly low grading a stand like this, meaning we're taking the deformed or less desirable trees and leaving the better trees. It's essentially turning industrial forestry on its head, and you're constantly low grading the stand. That way you always have the better trees for later. You're constantly leaving the trees that have better form, better live crown ratio, better growing potential, and you can actually increase the overall growth of the stand through doing active management. The goal of the organization that owns the property is to restore old growth or late seral form and function to this piece of property. So like we've mentioned before, there was harvesting here quite a long time ago, but there is a component of older trees that are left. Most of them were the smaller old trees from when they first came through. And when you look at the stumps here, the stumps are all in the 6 to 8, 9 foot diameter kind of range. They're very, very large stumps. This example of old growth Douglas fir tree, this tree is several hundred years old. It's growing right on the bank of the Metz River. And with the kind of forestry that we did no harvesting in that older age class at all. All of the old growth that was here pre-harvest is still here. What we worked with was the second growth that has come up in between this residual old growth forest, and then we cut through the diameter classes, meaning we cut some larger trees, more middle trees, even more real smaller trees to continue the whole size class distribution, as well as to open up small holes where we're going to get regeneration. Because the idea is we now have really old trees. We have a middle cohort of trees in the 50 to 80 year class. And now with some of the regeneration that we're going to get from this harvest, we're going to have a real young cohort of trees coming in and be able to keep the forest going through time by continuing to bring in a small age class. That's kind of a hallmark of selection sustainable forestry. Is each cut you bring in some new trees to fill in to the age structure. Now I'm standing right here next to a peeled redwood log. This had nothing to do with the commercial harvest, but it has to do with all of the other ecosystem services that this property provides for our community. And you can see the branch not sticking up, and it's been peeled of bark. It's because this tree is being harvested from the no-cut riparian area that we did no commercial harvest in along the Mattole. We came in after the plan was signed off, and we are now removing these trees under the auspices of a Department of Fish and Wildlife grant. And these will be cabled into the river to create complex fish habitat. And the branches raft up material that comes down the river. This kind of forestry is not just about the economics of cutting and growing trees and logging them out and putting them on a truck. It has to do with a bigger vision of land management, and there are lots of different tools that we can use as land managers in order to make the overall economic picture work. And we like to connect the social benefits and the employment benefits with the economic benefits to the landowner. In our particular case, we have been using a combination of carbon sales in certain areas around here, where you're agreeing to protect the amount of carbon on the ground for in perpetuity and just do harvesting above and beyond that, and you can access the new California market for carbon sales. It tends to work a lot better on larger pieces of ground, so it's difficult for small non-industrial private forest landowners to access that market. It's expensive, and there's a lot of inventory and things that you have to do in order to prove that you're meeting your contractual obligations. Conservation easements can be individually tailored to the needs of the landowner, and the typical thing is to reduce the amount of development that can happen on a property. That's where the value is. The subdivision potential, for example, is probably 80–90% of the value. And then many of us also will add forestry restrictions, and we're not talking restriction to timber harvest, restriction to certain kinds of timber harvest. For example, in many of our easements, we will preclude the use of clear cutting or other really heavy-handed, even-age regeneration techniques. This is selection forestry. You can see we've cut some pretty nice Douglas fir in here, but we actually left the better trees. In a crew from the conservation camp in town to do thinning from below, or fire hazard reduction. And the idea with that is that fire is an eventuality in California forests. It's not a question of if it's going to burn, it's a question of when and under what kinds of conditions. And so there's lots of different ways that we as foresters and land managers can prep a forest for the eventual introduction of fire. And so in this particular case, We did some commercial harvest of some of the larger trees, and then we went through and basically broke up the continuity of fuels from the ground to the canopy, because one of the biggest dangers, especially when you have a county road right next to you, is you have that cigarette butt or that overheating car or the chains on the trailer, and you have sparks and you have that fire source. So protecting our communities, we really want to break up that continuum of fuel so that if a ground fire starts, it doesn't go up into the branches and then get into the crowns of the trees where it's really hard, if not impossible, to stop. So in this particular area, we had probably 1,000 trees to the acre. I mean, they basically came in and they logged this out, and it grew back without the normal disturbance regime of small ground fires. Native people would have lit lots of ground fires. There would have been lightning fires, but instead we've been putting them out for the last 80 to 100 years. And so you get these really, really dense forests. We came in, removed the junky trees, left the best trees. It's that same thing we were talking about in the other stand, but on the smaller end of the trees. And we still leave some small trees. You got nice young redwoods that have decent crown position, that kind of stuff. But we really broke up the tan oak, took out some of the huckleberry, some of the other kinds of brush, and you've got some tan oak sprouts right here. There was some madrone that was taken out. Some of that was used for firewood, and most of it was lopped and scattered on the ground, and I'm standing in a burn pile right here where we burned a lot of the flashy fuels. As you can see on the ground, we pretty much burned everything under maybe 3 inches. That's the flashy, low hour fuel. It doesn't take very much for it to be the correct moisture conditions for that to burn. Bigger logs hold moisture for longer, and they're less of a concern. Agencies and restoration monies in order to get a bigger vision done on this property. There was the commercial timber harvest, the non-commercial timber harvest, there's the restoration, there's the road work. When you're doing land management, you need to have all the tools in the toolbox. An easement is one of those things that allows you to encumber the different rights you have in a piece of property. For example, when you buy a piece of property, you have the right to the water, you have the right to the minerals, maybe. Many properties around here, you have the mineral rights, you have the timber rights, you have the subdivision rights, you've got the right to build houses, and you can encumber any of those rights in any way that you want, as long as they can be proven to be protecting the public trust resources of the property. That's how the easement laws work. So we try to take this big, broad view, bring in community, use each of the different opportunities that we can in order to make it easier and more economically feasible to do this kind of exemplary forestry.